Progress.
And welcome to the August 10th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. My name is Chris Ramey and I'm the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. Thank you for joining us in this remote meeting format we're using as the state and community recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. This format enables the Planning Commission to meet, hear from the community, and take care of business while keeping its members, staff, and the public safe. Today, our meeting will begin with a public comment, followed by a work session on middle housing code amendments. There are several housekeeping announcements and instructions related to the meeting format I need to take care of first. Thank you for your patience as I work my way through them. Anyone wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 1, or by following the access instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. For those who join the meeting via computer device or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't done so already, please raise your virtual hand now to join the speakers queue in one of two ways. For those viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or other device, click once on the hand icon. For those listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. When the public comment period begins, our meeting moderator will announce the next two speakers at a time. When it's your turn, the moderator will announce your name and unmute your microphone. Public comment is limited to 10 minutes, so your time to speak will be based on the number of people signed up to speak. As always, feel free to contact staff if there is testimony you were not able to provide or wish to get to us in a different manner. With that, we'll go on to item A, which is public comment. Public comment is an opportunity for individuals to speak to the Planning Commission on any topics except items scheduled for a public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. Do we have anyone who wishes to speak this evening?
Greg Bryant had his hand up for a little bit and then he put it down. So, okay, he's back in queue. So I'm gonna invite you in here, Greg, and you can unmute in a second.
Okay. Let's see, I think we got through. The Planning Commission reserves 10 minutes, so try to be succinct. We like to limit you to 3 minutes. As a reminder, your hand must be raised, which it is. When it's your turn and you have been unmuted, please state your name clearly before beginning your comments. Staff will let you know when your time is up, and when your time is concluded, the moderator will mute your microphone and we'll move to the next speaker. With that, I think we're ready for public participation. Oh, there's Greg. Looking at all these people. There's got to be here somewhere. All right, Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to bring can everyone hear me, first of all? Yes? Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't looking at your screen. I was looking at my document. So I'm Greg Bryant. I've lived in Eugene on and off since 1973. And for some years until recently, I was on the U of O faculty and the Campus Planning Commission. And one of our go-to places for lunch and to bring guests was the Glenwood, which most of you know, on Alder Street on our lovely bicycle boulevard there. And it was in the news the other day because the city planning is considering letting a developer tear it and adjacent buildings basically on the corner of 13th and Alder down to build a monstrous 12-story building, which is very much out of character for the neighborhood, and also would get rid of a favorite faculty place for having lunch, which is also a very nice part of town. And for me, the basic principle of all urban planning is save the good stuff, fix what's broken, stop the bad stuff. So I know the limits of this organization, this committee, and its scope, but please do what you can to help me save something that I think is widely perceived as being good in the area. If you go to the Facebook announcement that KZI put up, 600 people were quite angry that the Glenwood might be torn down, along with all the trees and a massive building built on 2 major bicycle boulevards. I just wanted to provide a quote. I know we're all interested in transit-oriented development and compact urban growth, but there's a limit to that. To a certain degree, once it gets too high, a lot of the benefits of compact urban growth go away. High buildings, this is from a pattern language, the four-story limit pattern. High buildings have no genuine advantages except speculative gains for banks and landowners. They're not cheaper. They don't help to create open space. They destroy the townscape, social life. They promote crime. They make life difficult for children. They're expensive to maintain. They wreck all the open spaces near them and damage light and air and view. And quite apart from this, which shows that they aren't very sensible, empirical evidence shows that they damage people's minds and feelings. And that was written in 1977. And there are now thousands of supporting research documents that you can find on the web about all of those. And we could add some about accessibility. Tall buildings have corridors, which are worse for spreading respiratory diseases, which we're in the midst of that problem now. They increase the tenant distances from the community. The University College London has an energy institute, which has consistently found that tall buildings are less efficient both in construction, and this is over six stories, are less efficient in both construction and in maintenance and in ongoing costs and ongoing energy costs. So it's actually hurts our climate goals. And with parking minimums in place, it also increases auto traffic, which is another consequence of this kind of extreme density. And so actually allowing it is a kind of climate denial, which is, I know sounds like a very hurtful thing to say, but it is business as usual is kind of climate denial, as I think most of you know, and lots of things you guys fight for. And the bicycle boulevards are particularly vulnerable to this. 400 units with cars coming out onto the bicycle boulevards on Alder and 13th would be a real problem. So in any case, if any of you guys could chat with your planning colleagues and put in a word saying that you think that there are potential problems with building a 12-story building in the midst of a much shorter neighborhood adjacent to
Greg, your 3 minutes is up, so I think we feel pretty comfortable that we got that message. If Commissioner Ramey agrees.
Greg, thank you for taking time to come talk to us this afternoon. It's always helpful to see the citizens involved in our process, and I know it's extra special effort to come and talk to us. So thanks for doing that. Commissioner Taylor.
Thank you. I just had a quick question, just for clarity. Is the site privately owned? Does anybody know?
Yes, I believe the site is privately owned.
Yeah, so it's C2.
It's C2, okay.
It's C2 with the TD overlay. I just pulled it up. But thanks for that context, because well, it's great to hear that maybe in light of future planning. It's our current code. There's not a lot, is my understanding. There's not a lot planning staff can do. We have an adopted code for C2 TD overlay. So, yeah.
Okay. All right, so I don't see any other people in the queue for speaking. So if that's the case, we'll move along to agenda item B, which is a work session on the Middle Housing Code amendments. Terry Harding, thank you for joining us.
Good evening, commissioners. Is my microphone working okay? All right, great. I'll start sharing my screen. And now, please, somebody tell me you're seeing the slide and not my notes. Yay! Okay. So good evening. We have a work session tonight on the Middle Housing Code amendments. We've had a little bit of a break, but the work has been continuing in the background. So tonight we're going to talk about a quick review of the project goals around middle housing. I just want to highlight for you and for the public that's watching some public engagement highlights that we've been sharing with both you and the City Council from our public engagement process. Then we'll dive into a new topic, which we've talked about a little bit, but today is our first chance to really talk about what it means. and that's the Middle Housing Land Division Bill, Senate Bill 458. And we have Kate Rogers and Matt Hasty here to walk us through that. And we'll break for questions and come back to talk about Metro Plan amendments required to implement the House bill, and then walk through adoption process next steps. So as a reminder, the overall project goals are to comply with the House bill first and foremost, and that requires us to update our zoning to allow the middle housing types across the community. While we do that, we're also aiming to further equity and long-term affordability for housing in our community and enable housing availability and a diversity of types. Just have to move you out of the way of my notes here so I can see them. As you all well know, the public engagement process for the Middle Housing Project, it was lengthy, and over the last 10 months, we've done a variety of things that are described in a little bit more detail in your packet. On this slide are some of the major efforts that staff undertook based on the Planning Commission's approved and City Council supported public involvement plan. That plan focuses on equity and inclusion in an effort to broaden the voices we hear from on zoning and housing policy issues that affect everyone. After 10 months of outreach and events, we heard from hundreds of new voices from across Eugene, including people from every ward, different age groups, income ranges, renters and homeowners, and people of all races, and people who experience disabilities. On top of that, strong themes emerged from the outreach done with different groups and the general public. And here are some of those themes. And you might recognize this from a recent email that I sent to the City Council and copied the Planning Commission. Number one, focus on equity and inclusion as code choices are made through the adoption process. Number two, encourage and incentivize middle housing across the community by exceeding the minimum standards set by the state and treating all areas of the community equally. Theme number three, near transit routes encourage compact development by reducing parking requirements and allowing smaller lots and taller buildings. And theme number four, pursue housing incentives and programs beyond the land use code as part of the city's ongoing housing work. So that's a pretty high level reminder, but there is a comprehensive report on our website, and that's available to you anytime. Now I'd like to dive into our first meaty topic of the night, which is Senate Bill 458, and ask for Kate to walk you through these slides. And Kate, you can just let me know when you're ready for the next one.
Okay, thanks, Terry. And good evening, commissioners. And so Matt Hasty, my colleague at APG, is not actually here tonight. It's his wedding anniversary. So it's just me. You're stuck with me tonight. So I will do my best to explain Senate Bill 458, which is legislation that was passed by the Oregon State Legislature in May. And it's kind of a follow-up to House Bill 2001. And requires cities that are subject to House Bill 2001 to allow those middle housing types that are now will now be permitted pretty broadly in the city to be those lots to be divided through a middle housing land division. And this applies to any middle housing type that will be permitted under this new rule. So duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, row houses, and cottage clusters. And one of the key provisions of SB 458 is that the land division does not change the housing type after the land is divided. So for example, a fourplex that's divided into individual lots doesn't turn into row houses. For the sake of applying the development code, it's still considered a fourplex. Similarly, a cottage cluster development, those are small detached units. They don't become single family or single detached units after the land is divided. So all of the additional options that are granted to, say, a single family home, for example, having an accessory dwelling unit, those will not be allowed for cottage clusters, unless the city chooses to make that sort of policy decision. And also SB 458 has some pretty specific provisions that limits how cities can sort of process these middle housing land divisions, including limiting the review criteria that cities can apply in reviewing the applications and the conditions of approval that can be attached to an application. And the review procedure is specified in the bill, and that's the expedited land division procedure. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide, please, Terry. So to take a quick look at some of the requirements. The land division must result in exactly one dwelling unit on each lot. So you couldn't, for example, have a fourplex that is divided into like a duplex and two separate units. Each unit has to be on its own lot through the middle housing land division. Each lot or each unit must have separate utilities that's specified in the bill. Easements are required for pedestrian access, any common areas, so common yards or community buildings, things like that, driveways and parking areas, and utilities. So there needs to be sort of a legal document that shows that you're able to essentially cross lot lines to access your property and to get utilities to your property and things like that. And all proposals must meet the building code, so not just the development code, but building code standards also apply. So this is particularly relevant for things like firewall construction between units. So you couldn't have a duplex that is built without that fire separation between the units. It would have to meet the building code for separate units on individual lots. And then the city's development code standards, things like setbacks and lot coverage, will apply to the parent lot that's divided, but they would not apply to resulting lots. So things like side setbacks wouldn't apply to the individual lots, and lot coverage, similar idea there. Next slide, please. So one area where I think when we first were reading the legislation, we thought that the city had cities had more options in terms of the kind of sequence of events in terms of building permit, land division. But it turns out that really cities, it could be argued that cities have to allow kind of a range of timing scenarios. So the way the legislation is written, it seems that cities have to allow land divisions before building permits are applied for. So that's kind of the more typical land division procedure. You apply, you go through the sort of tentative plat process, and you get the lots created, and then you apply for your building permits. So cities seem to have to allow that. But they also seem to have to allow allow land divisions after the middle housing development is approved or constructed. So you could have a built or approved middle housing development, and then the city would need to allow that to be divided. And then it also appears, and DLCD has provided guidance that this also applies to existing middle housing that was built before House Bill 2001, as long as that development meets all of the city's current adopted middle housing development code standards. And that scenario could be unlikely potentially, would have to meet all of the design standards and things like that would apply to that middle housing, but it's certainly possible. So that would need to be allowed as well. And then SB 458 specifies that cities have the option of allowing concurrent review of land divisions and building permits. So the city could potentially allow an applicant to submit all of those materials at the same time and have a concurrent review. All right, next slide, please. So that was one option, and that's mentioned here again. Some other options that are provided in the bill are that cities can require street frontage improvements and right-of-way dedication for the lots that are created that are abutting a street. But under the city's current procedures, it would have to demonstrate that rough proportionality or provide Dolan findings to show that is constitutionally justifiable. And then cities also have the option of applying, tentative and final plat review procedures consistent with their current platting standards. Next one, please. And then the bill is pretty clear about what cities cannot require. So cities can't require that any lots created from a middle housing land division have street frontage. So cities, or excuse me, lots don't need to have street frontage. They could be essentially landlocked. You know, and here's an example of a cottage cluster where if these units were divided to be on individual lots, some of those units would not have access to a street, so there would have to be an easement provided across some of the lots that do have street frontage to get to those units. Also, cities can't require parking or driveway access to each lot. So you can require parking as part of the middle housing development. So you could say a triplex has to have 3 parking spaces, but you can't say that each one of those parking spaces has to be on the same lot as the resulting units. So, you know, you would have to, at a minimum, require that easement access to the parking or the driveways. Cities also can't decide what the minimum lot size or dimensions are for any of the resulting lots. So basically, whatever configuration applicants want to propose, as long as they meet, you know, the applicable development standards and the building code, the city can't deny an application on that basis. And then any other review criteria that's not specifically identified in the bill is kind of off the table. Next one, please, Terry. So SB 458 says that middle housing land divisions must go through the expedited land division procedure. And this procedure is outlined in state statute in the ORS. And currently it only applies to residential land divisions that meet very specific criteria. And so they really haven't been broadly used in Oregon, and a lot of cities, including Eugene, have not incorporated that procedure into their development codes. They just kind of refer to the ORS and say, you know, they identify the option for applicants, but have to apply the ORS directly to applications if an applicant requests this process. But so now SB 458 really expands this procedure to all middle housing land divisions. If an applicant wants to apply for one of these and meets all the standards that are specified in the bill, then the city would have to use this expedited land division procedure. And basically, you know, it's a little bit shortened relative to the kind of state mandated typical land division procedure. And so there's a 21-day completeness review, 14-day comment period. The decision has to be rendered within 63 days after the application is deemed complete. Only the applicant and any parties that submitted written comments during that 14-day comment period can appeal the decision. And the decision maker on any appeals is a city appointed referee, which is often the hearings officer, but it could be a different party that the city appoints. And then any appeals of that decision would go to the Oregon Court of Appeals. So that's the process.
Commissioner Taylor, did you want to, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Kate.
It's fine.
I don't know, Commissioner Taylor, do you want to wait just a couple more slides and then ask questions, or?
It's totally up to you.
Well, Kate, how do you want to do this?
I think we've got just a couple more slides. So I think if you can hold off for a couple minutes.
Okay.
That'd be great. So, you know, we didn't have time to kind of think through the full implications of what this means for Eugene's code specifically, but we did want to identify some kind of initial considerations and options for you to consider. So one is, it'll be important to determine what submittal requirements will be needed, because this is something that's not really laid out in the bill language. You know, a middle housing land division could potentially be pretty complicated, and the plat could have easements going everywhere, and you know, the lot lines aren't kind of this typical plat. And so the submittal requirements, what the applicant submits, need to be easily evaluated by staff to see, you know, whether they're meeting the development code and the building code and all the utility requirements and the easements and things like that. The city will also need to figure out how to ensure that all proposed improvements are constructed. So in the example that we have pointed to is cottage potentially a large cottage cluster development with, it could have multiple shared common courtyards, multiple pathways, pedestrian paths going everywhere, and driveways and parking areas. And the city will want to make sure that all those improvements are constructed, because potentially you could do a land division and the lots could be sold off. And how do you make sure that those improvements are put in place? So we identified a couple of potential options. One is withholding the final plat approval until certain improvements are in place, or potentially waiting until final occupancy. The city might want to consider incorporating this idea of land divisions into the housing type definitions themselves, just to acknowledge that, say, a duplex, which is currently defined as 2 units on a single lot, could also be 2 units on separate lots if they're approved through this middle housing land division process, because it doesn't change the housing type itself. We would recommend creating a new procedure for middle housing land divisions, just to make sure that process is really clear for applicants, and potentially also incorporating the expedited land division procedure, which so far has only kind of lived in state statute, incorporating that procedure into the code itself. Also wanted to point out that the city can continue to provide kind of a more standard path for creation of middle housing under a typical kind of land division process. So currently row houses kind of go through a more standard tentative plat, final plat, and then you apply for building permits. And so far we've been proposing kind of a similar process for cottage clusters, and the city can totally continue allowing that option as long as, applicants know that this kind of more streamlined expedited land division process also exists. And that, there are some limitations associated with that SB 458 process. So it might be beneficial for applicants to have both choices. And then just to point out that currently duplexes are allowed to be divided under specific standards, and there are currently minimum lot sizes for the parent lot and for the resulting child lots. And those are proposed to be revised as part of the HB 2001 package. But essentially, these are more or less precluded by SB 458 because cities can no longer, for us middle housing land division, cities can't specify minimum lot sizes. So it's possible that those become sort of obsolete. There might be some existing duplexes out there that wouldn't meet all the middle housing standards, and you might want to allow those to be divided. But I think staff will probably need to take a closer look at that. All right, and then this is just a really quick kind of example scenario to show how this will play out for a potential fourplex where, each one of these units could be divided to be on its own lot. Each unit would have to have separate utilities. And then, as you can see, the shared parking area would, kind of be split. Could potentially, this isn't a real proposal. This is just one way it could potentially be done. Could be split between these 2 lots, and then there would have to be easements over all of that shared kind of pedestrian and vehicle access area. And then next slide. This is our last slide. So again, the rear lots that aren't closer to the street, or the rear units that aren't close to the street, those could potentially be lots that don't have street frontage. So there would have to be, again, an easement connecting those lots to the street, and the city can't preclude that. And this kind of blue colored lot doesn't have direct access to the parking area. So there would have to be, an easement connecting that unit to the parking area. And then just to point out that the city can require street frontage improvements potentially, again, if it can provide findings that those are roughly proportional for the development. And I think that's it. So yeah, happy to take any questions if I can. And I'm also probably going to rely on staff to help me out. And I know Lauren is here. She knows a lot about this. So if I don't have the answers, hopefully someone else does.
Well, thank you, Kate. Just when you thought it was safe to go outside, here's another one of these. They're keeping us awake at night. Commissioner Taylor.
It was good we waited. Kate, you answered my question because I heard early on that the plat process would still be allowed, yet this expedited process was required as an additional process. So what I heard you explain is that, and I can see value in potentially both, especially depending on what the end result of the implications are and the processes are. So that's great. So I would assume that's something the city's going to consider as more as evaluated, or we're going to consider. So that was a great clarification. The next one, I'm not quite sure I understood. I mean, it's pretty clear in the AIS about the duplex division lots. What I didn't understand, Kate, is when you said, what did you say the city want, that there might need to be some additional consideration? I wasn't following, I didn't track that as well.
So the current standards say that, an existing duplex can be divided so each unit is on its own lot. And it establishes a minimum lot size for the parent parcel and for the resulting lots. And so for a middle housing land division, the city couldn't apply those lot size standards, but a middle housing land division, for an existing middle housing development, that development would need to meet all of the current development code standards, which it wasn't necessarily subject to at the time it was developed. So it's possible that it wouldn't meet all of those standards. And I can't even think of a great example of what it might not meet. Maybe it wouldn't meet the lot coverage or something like that. And in that case, it wouldn't be eligible for the middle housing land division, but potentially it could be still eligible for the duplex division process that already exists. So that's a pretty narrow scenario, but it's theoretically possible.
Other commissioners, questions?
By the way, excellent job, Kate. Excellent job.
Thank you.
Commissioner Fragola.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm wondering about the timeline necessary for this. It seemed like you were saying that we need to have this in place at the same pace as the middle housing code package. I guess I had thought originally we would be on an alternate timeline. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, I can speak to the sort of legislative timeline, which is that this applies to all middle housing land divisions after or starting on July 1st, 2022. So essentially it takes effect at the same time that the HB 2001 provisions have to take effect. That's the time that cities have to comply with House Bill 2001. And so cities don't necessarily have to act for this to be available. Cities have the option of just kind of letting this live in the state statute and not incorporating any of the provisions into their code. But I think that's not an advisable path. And I think it wouldn't work as well for staff or for applicants to do that. So I can let staff answer in terms of like the adoption timeline.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit more information and then welcome Lauren to jump in. Because this was more recently passed legislation, we're not quite sure yet whether it can kind of catch up to all the work that we've done on the middle housing code amendments themselves. So we're at this point in time working on the language, but not sure if it will be able to go at the same public hearing as the middle housing code amendments. So in any case, we've talked with Lauren about having separate ordinances. And so they have the same effective date, legal deadline of June 30th, 2022, but don't have to be adopted as one package. Anything to add, Lauren?
No, I mean, I guess I'll just kind of restate what both Terry and Kate said, which is unlike House Bill 2001, there's no penalty to the city for not adopting our own version of the middle housing land division ordinance by a particular date. We could, as Kate said, just rely on the state statute, but I think that could create some areas of confusion, some loopholes. There are good reasons for us to incorporate those processes into our own code to make sure that they match, what we have going on, and to put a Eugene spin on them to the extent that we need to. And as Terry said, this bill came a lot later than House Bill 2001, and so staff is still working on trying to put together the language that we would propose for the Eugene code. And so it's likely that we won't be ready with it at the same time that we would be providing DLCD notice of the middle housing code amendments. But I think the hope is that eventually those two processes would dovetail to the point where adoption, hopefully, and certainly effective date would be the same.
Okay, that was my question as well, so thank you for supplying that detail. Commissioner Beeson.
Thanks. Yeah, I had the same question on process. So it sounds like, I would think, my own opinion is that we ought to make this part of our code as opposed to letting it just reside in the state statute. And assuming there's agreement on that and we do it, I also think we ought to do what we can to, I understand that it doesn't necessarily, wouldn't necessarily track exactly with the HB 2001 public hearing process we're doing and that the council will do. But given all that, it seems like it would be good to have it all approved and in place by mid 2022. What seems really nice about this, when you kind of read through it, at least to me, it seems like a really nice companion to HB 2001, and of a nice supporting piece of legislation, where it kind of removes some more barriers to subdividing the lots. It allows you to do that pretty efficiently. And it basically allows for creation of more kind of affordable, a wider range of property, if you will, for a wider range of people to buy housing units. And it just seems to me it's a very good thing and very helpful. And I think if we can just kind of make it happen at the same time as HB 2001, that would be kind of the intent of the legislation. So that's just a comment I've got there. I've got a couple of other things I'll kind of hold off for another round, but I have a couple of other comments too. Thanks.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Mine's a real quick question. Do we have a rough idea, if we were from planning staff, if we were to try to implement this on the same timeline, is that even feasible? I mean, how complicated is this to kind of fold this into the existing timeline we have for the rollout? This we're about, I think, about 80% the way through the the first round. How difficult it would be for one, and then two, if it's not really feasible to without a tremendous amount of additional hearings or whatever, if we maybe start putting a doodle poll on adding maybe one little layer extra meeting per month to kind of accelerate it so that it's overlaying as close as we can to that target goal.
I don't think it will be super difficult to catch it up to where we are with the rest of the code amendments. The bill is limited in scope to just land divisions. We already have a process for land divisions. That being said, it's more Jeff and his team's area of expertise. So I'll let you jump in, Jeff, if you want to say anything about that. But my sense as the project manager is that we can do it.
I absolutely agree, Terry. I think there is potential for us to do it. I just don't want to force it if we're not going to be writing good code in doing so. And so that's why while we recognize that it might be possible to catch it up, we do want to make sure that we're doing things right and just have another public hearing if we have to. So we'll kind of wait and see how we do in the code development phase to see how complicated and how many things it kind of links onto.
Yeah, I just to echo what Commissioner Beeson said, I think none of us will, he said it closely. This actually sounds like good news. This sounds like something that's going to work and create lower cost entry point units for people because it's shrinking the amount of land they have to buy. And I think we scratched our heads a little bit about the row house when we were looking at that because the lots were getting so small. So I think this is really headed us in the right direction. So anything we can do to kind of get it all, you know, coordinated, I think that helps us get to lower price point for units, and that's a big goal for this project. Commissioner Fragola.
I'm definitely supportive of this option. I mean, we've heard so much and we've discussed a lot about increasing access to home ownership. The thing I'm wondering is, does this have the potential to increase costs? And what can we do in the planning / application process to make sure that it's not doing that?
Go ahead, Kate.
Well, do you mean cost to the applicant or to the city and reviewing the applications?
I'm talking about to developers, to the applicant.
To developers.
Which, because that increases the cost to homeowners, to buyers, to renters.
I mean, I would think that the assurance that this option provides would reduce costs for developers, because a developer there would be some certainty that this proposal, as long as it meets the building code, it meets the development code, it meets all of the things that are outlined in the bill, it will be approved by the city, because the city doesn't have the option to deny it. There's this expedited process, which, you know, it's arguable how much it's really expedited relative to the city's current processes. But, you know, the developer knows that it will be approved within a certain time frame, which, you know, they know that they won't be holding on to the land and that sort of thing unnecessarily. So I'm not seeing ways where it might increase costs, but if there's anything that you are thinking of that you want to point out, I'm very open to that.
Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, in reference to that, I guess one of the other comments I wanted to make, you had a slide where you were asking us for, I took it that you were looking, Terry, and for input on the consideration and option slide. You had another one about where you talked about what the city may require, and it was talking about the frontage improvements and the right-of-way dedication. I guess just a quick comment on that, and kind of in reference to I mean, I agree with what Commissioner Fragola is saying, and we want to do what we can we don't want to be increasing costs. It seemed to me on that, just some feedback on that. My understanding is we don't need to, if they're just developing a middle housing on one lot, there's not a requirement for the frontage improvements or the right-of-way dedication. So the question was, if they split, say, a fourplex into 4 lots, the city may require it. And my thought would be, I couldn't think of reasons why, understanding there may be some I don't know about, but it seemed to me would be good not to add those kind of requirements. So all the way through this, as we look at it, to be careful adding additional requirements or adding additional barriers, and just keep this thing so that if somebody develops the middle housing and it's a triplex or a fourplex and it's the single level and so on, they could split it into 4 lots and they could sell it to 4 different buyers and certainly reduce their costs. So that's just a comment.
Commissioner Fiorelli.
Thank you, Commissioner Ramey. I want to support the idea of including this in code language at the city level. I think that's an important thing to do for clarity. I also think that it's possible we could have a large number, potentially a sizable number of people wanting to do this. I want to focus my question specifically around the city appointed referee. I was looking at the SB 458 language recently, just before this meeting. One of the things I noticed is that the city appointed referee, one, must not be a member or a staff member. It sounds like that's a language there. Who might be an appropriate referee? And the second question is that I noticed that the city has 7 days to appoint the referee, and the referee then has 42 days to make a decision before they're stripped of any compensation they might receive as a result of providing that service. Can there be more than one referee when these applications are being processed so that we don't have a bottleneck? And I'm thinking here about administrative costs as well as the cost to developers over time.
I can quickly jump in, and then I'll look to maybe Alyssa for an explanation of how we use our hearings officials currently. But you're correct, Commissioner Fiorelli, that the referee cannot be a city employee, a full-time city employee. But the bill is also very clear that it's okay to use a hearings official in the referee position. And we do have hearings officials that we contract for various things, including land use decisions now. And I believe that we have a number of them. So the city could, I think, relatively easily contact one of our various hearings officials if an appeal of one of these middle housing land divisions comes up and say, can you take it? And then there, as you pointed out, there are specific time limits within which the referee needs to make their decision. And there are consequences for that not happening. And one other thing that is different than your typical land use decision is that an appeal of the referee's decision, who I assume will be one of our hearings officials, does not go to LUBA. It goes directly to the Court of Appeals. So I think that will just be different. It's a different set of processes. There are potentially more costs to an appellant to go straight to the Court of Appeals because LUBA has relatively low filing fees. They allow folks to be self-represented. At the Court of Appeals, the filing fees are larger, and generally it requires an attorney. So did that answer all of your questions? Okay.
Yes, I think we'll probably cover this again in the future. I understand this is probably a cursory overview of this legislation. I will have more questions that I think probably will get ironed out over time. Thank you.
All right, other questions from commissioners? Well, I don't see any. And again, Kate, thank you for that presentation. It was helpful. Thanks.
Good. You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm going to put the presentation back up and move into our next piece. Thank you, Kate. This next piece is about the Metro Plan. And then the last piece of the presentation is about next steps in the adoption process. So there is an attachment in your packet that covers this item. What the Metro Plan does is establish a blueprint for growth in the Eugene Springfield region. It contains a diagram that I've put here in the slide. I know you can't really read it, but it's familiar to those of us that deal with land use applications. And the colors on this map represent different categories of land use. So I just want to call your attention to the light yellow color, which is the low density residential. And a very difficult color to see on this map, which is tan, is the medium density. And then the dark orange, not to be confused with the sort of burnt orange outside the UTB, which is agriculture. But inside, like here in the Chase Gardens area, north of Alton Baker Park, is high density residential. So why that's important is that the Metro Plan is the plan that Eugene relies on right now for its housing policies. And so there's an element of the Metro Plan called Residential Land Use and Housing Element, and it contains density policies, including policy A9, which establishes density ranges or requires cities to establish density ranges in our zoning and development regulations that are consistent with the broad density categories of the plan. So those categories, as I was just mentioning, are low density, medium density, and high density. And I've put in bold the density ranges here from the Metro Plan. So the most glaring conflict with House Bill 2001 is with low density, which establishes a density range up to 10 dwelling units per gross acre, which can then translate, because of right-of-way dedications, into 14.28 units per net acre in Eugene's zoning code. In order to rectify this conflict between House Bill 2001, which says you can't rely on density limits for the middle housing types, and these policies, we're proposing this draft amendment. And I'll just read it for the sake of those watching and for the public record. We're proposing to add this language. The low, medium, and high density ranges established in this policy A9 do not apply to the following housing types located within the city of Eugene: duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. The city of Eugene may establish density requirements which comply with state law for duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. If an adopted refinement plan is inconsistent with this policy will prevail. And so that is the simplest way that we thought we could rectify the conflict and make it clear that Eugene's new regulations control when it comes to density of middle housing. And that is a requirement of the House bill. The last thing I wanted to mention is that we are working on adopting our own comprehensive plan. We've adopted several chapters of it, along with the urban growth boundary. And next up for consideration are completing our own housing chapter and our own compact development and urban design chapter. We will have the opportunity when we look at those policy chapters to include new policies around middle housing and other things that have been emerging through statewide planning and planning needs and trends. So be on the lookout for that. The Metro Plan language that I just showed you would serve us for as long as it needs to until we adopt other policies that are specific to Eugene. And then I'll just walk through these last two slides and then break for another set of questions. Our adoption process next steps are outlined here and then in kind of graphic form in your packet and on the next slide. So this is August 10th is the meeting date we're at right now. We're reviewing a couple of pieces we haven't talked about before. The rest of the code that you've already discussed is going through a process of legal review. And our intention is to bring it back to you as a complete package for a work session in late September. And then we would hold our Planning Commission public hearing on October 12th and schedule you for 3 deliberation meetings, October 19th, 26th, and a date in November to be determined, which we're still polling for. To keep on this timeline of council process and room for appeals, we're attempting to finish your deliberations by early November and then check in with the council at a joint meeting in late November. This is a tentative date, but our hope is to do it in the window of time after the Planning Commission finishes its deliberations and before the council begins its own work sessions. Then we have a little bit of a holiday break, and our plan is to come back to City Council in January and February for their work session, hearing, and their deliberations in action. Those are still being calendared with the City Manager's office. And all of that is to give us a little bit of time still to try to resolve any appeals before the state deadline of June 30th, 2022. This is what it looks like laid out on a little chart with this stretch of blue here between March and June to give the city some time to resolve any appeals. And that's all I have. So I'll stop sharing and ask for your questions.
Thank you, Terry. Start with Commissioner Beeson.
So I appreciate the information. We haven't really done anything on the Metro plan that I recall in the 2 years I've been on the commission, and so I spent some time with it. I think I understand what you're doing, what you're proposing. It makes sense. I like the amendment, looked fine to me. I guess I was feeling the need to set it into a little bit more context. All the time I was kind of looking at it was how it was sort of fitting in there. And so a couple of questions. When we do an amendment, or in terms of what you're thinking about for an amendment like this, the Metro plan has the type 1, type 2, and type 3 amendments. And so would this just be Eugene making an amendment? I'm seeing Alyssa shaking her head, yes. So it'd be a type 1 amendment. I'm assuming it would then, when we make an amendment like this, back to kind of the process question we had on the other thing, would this take some sort of, once it's kind of finalized, we've all had our discussion, there would be something that would probably take some kind of a public hearing, and then we'd make a recommendation on to the council, and the council would have make the final approval, right?
Yes, that's correct. And we would bundle this with the code amendments. So
okay.
That would all be part of the adoption package.
Okay. Then I guess kind of the last thing, and I know we want to kind of, I'm assuming we want to limit this and do just what we need to do. And I was reading in there, Springfield has done some things in previous years. It sounds like they kind of have their own housing chapter or equivalent, if I was reading it all right. But you put the plan diagram up, and I found as I was going through the Metro plan, it seemed like there were places in there where it would be nice to sort of update things. And I saw in there provisions for updating periodically, and it looked like it was done every several years, and I couldn't quite figure out when the last one was done and so on. And not to go into a lot of detail, but I found myself in several places thinking, gosh, it'd be nice to sort of change the wording here and kind of update this a little bit. And I particularly got myself hung up on the plan diagram that you referenced, where the bulk, and I know it's not parcel specific, I get that, but you look at the plan diagram, and the bulk of the land on there, of course, is low density residential, which is exactly what you're addressing in the amendment. And I found myself wondering why we wouldn't want to revise the designation on there and make it more consistent with what our zoning and our city housing plans would look like given the advent of middle housing. So I'll just leave it there. It's kind of, I don't mean to be too open-ended a question, but it seems to you're making it, we're doing a very focused amendment here of a few words that are going to land in the middle of a big document. And I'm just kind of curious if there are some other things we could pick up at the same time.
Yeah, thanks for that comment and question. It's a great point. And the Metro plan is definitely a work in progress. It predates a lot of things, including House Bill 3337, which required the separation of Eugene and Springfield's urban growth boundaries. And so the plan diagram is a bit out of date, and our intention is over time to migrate things that are specific to Eugene to our own comprehensive plan. So we're partway through that. We've done that with the adoption of the urban growth boundary and our own residential land study, which is an appendix to our urban growth boundary and comprehensive plan. Same thing for the job supply study and appendix. But we have some things that will still need to remain regional in nature over the life of the plan, like the regional transportation system, wastewater system, public facilities, things like that. So those things need to remain in the Metro plan, and other things, especially given the separation of the UGBs, are more appropriately handled at the city level. So we do have on our work plan completion of the comprehensive plan chapters. The two I mentioned were housing and compact development and urban design, but there are a few others that we're not done with. And as you mentioned, the diagram. So our project around the diagram is to actually make it parcel specific and adopt it for the city of Eugene's urban growth boundary as a map that can be precisely interpreted at the city level and land application level. So you're right on track with all your comments.
Well, okay. So at this point, we'd be looking to make the amendment the way you're proposing, and we would be looking to have our own housing chapter put in place some point here and kind of migrate over to it.
Yeah, and to clarify, once we adopt our own local housing chapter, then the housing chapter in the Metro Plan would no longer apply to Eugene. Yeah.
Or Springfield. I think it will go away.
Kind of like, I mean, that's the employment chapter currently does not apply to either city. I don't know if it's still in the document, but it doesn't apply to either city. So it'll be similar to that, except we'll take it out.
So I had a basic question to start with. I have a few other questions too, but the basic question is, were there other alternatives to the solution that you're proposing? Or is this really the only path that we have?
It's not the only path. I think it's the simplest path and the path that does what we need it to do, given that we have other projects waiting in the wings that would end up replacing whatever we do here. So I think what staff felt like was that the best use of our time and the bodies that have to review all of these amendments time would be to do something like this, because it's a temporary solution until we finish our diagram and our housing policies for Eugene. But yeah, we could do other things.
So this is a sort of a stopgap until these other larger issues are finalized, and then we're able to revise the Metro Plan comprehensively.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I would say that Springfield is looking at similar language that exempts them and directs the reader of the Metro Plan to the state law instead of the density ranges that are in there now. And the other good news is that our housing chapter and parcel specific diagram are not way off in the future. They're hopefully going to be funded and given resources as part of the housing implementation pipeline project by the end of the year, which council is considering at the end of the year. So they're not too far off in the future, which is another reason we felt like a temporary solution would be a good one.
I'm looking at page 15 of the of our AIS. There's a very specific mention in item 6 about small dwelling units. I don't know if we've defined what a small dwelling unit is. And then there's a mention of 25%. So these are two things I wasn't sure. At first I thought you were talking about ADUs, but we don't use that phrase here. And then there's this very specific mention of 25%. I'm just curious about where 25% came from and what is a small dwelling unit.
So Commissioner Ramey, just to clarify, and I think Jeff is probably ready to jump in as well, the language that is on page 15 of your packet is for the code update, not for the Metro Plan. So that is
okay.
It's just intended as context to kind of help put the Metro Plan proposal into context. Okay. And then I can let Jeff speak to your specific questions, but I think that the other piece is that this is proposed language that is, that staff and my office are currently in the process of reviewing. And so I don't expect any huge substantive changes, but it might not look exactly the same when it comes back to you in a few weeks. So.
All right, well, I can save my questions for that. Now I just have a general question, which is that this is gets my attention because the unit per acres, if you do the math on these numbers, are quite large. And I worry about some of the low density residential areas that are near areas of employment or transit corridors or universities. and it seems likely that those are the ones that are likely to change their density rather significantly as we go down this path. But am I thinking about this right?
The lot areas, I mean, when you do calculate the density based on the lot areas that the Planning Commission supported, you are looking at things that would be classically or traditionally, according to the Metro Plan, calculated as high density residential. Yeah, but it's one of the reasons why that change to the Metro Plan is necessary.
And there isn't any obvious fix for this, because the whole idea is to scatter these kinds of housing throughout the community. So the antithesis is to create areas of low, medium, and high density housing.
Yeah, and just as an example, anytime you have 2 dwelling units on a lot greater than like 4,300 square feet, you're exceeding the low density residential. So that's, just as an example of how low that truly is. So when the Planning Commission is supporting these lot areas that you did, yeah, you're going to be going over. But I think that's that was based on your feedback and the feedback that we got from the community outreach that we did.
Right. Well, it certainly got my attention. It's not a little, it's a lot. It's a big number. And I remember we talked about that a little bit around the row houses and what those are unit breakers. Those are going to end up to be, but I hadn't done the math on the rest of these to see what the rest of them are. Okay, thank you. Any other questions from commissioners?
You guys might enjoy a nice summer evening with a short meeting. I don't know.
Well, no. Okay. I think we can finish this agenda item and move us on to items from commissioners or staff, our agenda item C. Are there any items from commissioners or staff?
I do have items, but I would defer to the commission first if they have anything to share.
Commissioners.
I'm sharing. Okay. All right, I'll jump in just as a reminder I think you all know this, but for those watching at home as well, that starting next month, you're going to be moving to a different schedule where you're going to meet, your regular meetings will be the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays in the evening, so 5:30 meetings. The commission, it was my understanding that the city council had been talking about going to hybrid meetings next month. I haven't circled back with anybody on that, but I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm not going to worry about making hybrid meetings for the Planning Commission until we see a change in the health and safety of our community. So I think let's for now, I think September definitely online, October definitely online. We'll continue to revisit that, but I think we're going to just stick with Zoom for now. With no set date of when we return to a hybrid, although someday. And then just in terms of your upcoming meetings, you do have one scheduled for September 14th. We don't have any agenda items at this time. We'll see if we have something that we need to bring to you. As Terry mentioned, September 28th is a middle housing work session. I need to figure out when to bring elections and subcommittee assignments to you. That typically doesn't take too much time, so we might be able to wrap that into the September 28th meeting. And then I'm still working out the logistics of a land acknowledgement training. I know that's a high priority, so that's not fallen off the plate. It's just there's some complications that would bore you, so don't worry about it. We will get that scheduled. And then, as Terry mentioned, joint work session with council is also tentatively planned for late November. And then for those of you interested in watching on the council's discussion on accessory dwellings, there is a work session. Council has a work session on September 15th. Otherwise, we don't have any, I don't think we have any set council dates for the fall, and they are on break right now. So that's all I have at the moment.
All right, great. Well, those were a lot. Thank you, Alyssa. You're busy as always. No rest for you guys, I'm sure. I think we can adjourn ourselves then and enjoy our summer evening. Stay cool, and we're back perhaps the 14th, but for sure on the 28th.
Yes.
Let us know. All right, well, with that, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you all. Thomas, welcome to your first full meeting. Well done. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you. I mean, congratulations.